Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In this week's episode, we're talking about why a best-selling author moved most of his content production to Substack. David Kushner had the kind of mainstream success that most writers dream of. His writing regularly appeared in glossy print magazines like Wired and Rolling Stone. Several of his books became national bestsellers, and his work has even been adapted into multiple TV shows and movies. But in 2021, David decided to bypass legacy media entirely and start publishing his work to a Substack newsletter. What drove him to do this? In our discussion, David explained how the changing norms over IP rights and his own desire to experiment with serialized storytelling motivated him to make the move. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about this week's sponsor. That sponsor is the Creator Economy Expo. It takes place from May 2nd to the 4th at the Arizona Grand Resort in Phoenix. It's an event dedicated to individual content creators and small media companies. Over 40 sessions will help you grow your audience, drive new revenue lines, sharpen up content operations, and teach you about Web3 business models. The event is limited to just 500 and includes amazing speakers like the 5-time New York Times bestseller Dan Pink, TikTok Twitch star Leash Capiche, Ann Hanley, Joe Pulizzi, Roberto Blake, and 30 other world-class content/media entrepreneurs. Sign up today and get your all-access pass and $200 off the already low rate by going to cex.events and use coupon code SIMON. That's cex.events and coupon code SIMON. I'll leave a link in the description. And there's a pretty good chance that I'll actually be attending this event, so if you're going, definitely reach out so we can schedule coffee or drinks. Okay, on to my interview with David. Hey David, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start by setting the stage for what your career was like prior to launching a Substack newsletter. Like you had one of those enviable careers where you wrote for glossy magazines and signed major book deals. How did you first get into journalism in the first place?
Well, it was in college, and basically I was studying in London, and I had to I was required to join a student club, and I picked the newspaper because I thought I could get free concert tickets. And then, it just went from there. And then in the early 90s, basically, I had moved to New York with the goal of writing for Rolling Stone magazine. And I started working at a bulletin board service, a BBS, which was before the web, dial-up modems to these kind of text-only, services. And I'd worked at a music BBS for a while. And basically, by the time the internet really took off, like mid 90s, I was there with some experience that I could draw from and start writing about it. And kind of became that person, at Spin Magazine and then later Rolling Stone, writing about this nascent digital culture.
And were you being paid to write for these bulletin boards, or you were just on them for fun?
No, I was working at one full time. It was called SonicNet, and they were trying to be like the Rolling Stone of this online world. And so I was hired full time. And my job was to actually bring artists on and interview them. We didn't even call it chat back then. We didn't know what to call it. It was, like I said, it was before the web. We were calling them happenings. And I would just get whoever I could to come down to our like rat-infested loft and Tribeca, and then, have them answer questions over a computer, which felt very much like science fiction at the time. But so it was artists like, it was people like David Byrne and Radiohead and I don't know, No Doubt, I remember. So it was really the early days of the internet, and that's where I was working full time.
And people would like pay to access these bulletin boards?
So they would go on, it was this, one particular bulletin board, and yeah, you would subscribe, and basically to go on there and to have these chats, and then we would have reviews and sort of online features and things like that. It was started by a guy in New York who owned some music clubs, and it was an exciting time, I mean, to be there at the birth of a new medium was really very cool for me. And then, and the way that I saw it was, I kind of connected the dots because, I definitely wanted to be a writer. I mean, that was my aspiration. But, there were a lot of writers out there, and they all seemed to be covering areas pretty well: music, politics, sports, whatever. And I just saw an opportunity because of the internet and gaming as something that I could write about. And that's really what I did full force. And then I eventually left SonicNet and then began freelance writing full time.
And sorry, I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
Okay.
So you logged in, and did it look like a message board? Did it look like a chat?
I'm really dating myself here.
What did it look like?
Right, exactly. Well, so basically, in before the web, in the kind of late '80s, early '90s, there were these online systems called bulletin board services, and what that meant was that you would have a modem. And, you could have, it was all text-based content that would be on your computer, and it may be, it could be anything. It could be, I mean, a lot of the early ones were like devoted to Star Trek, and the Grateful Dead and things like that. And then other people would dial this phone number, and they would essentially connect to your computer, and they would see this content that you had created. So nobody was really thinking about it as a platform for writing. It was just more of a community place to share things. But I was very interested in it as a nascent platform for writing. And so as a writer, as an editor at SonicNet, I was experimenting with all kinds of different things we were doing as a team. Like I said, I mean, some were straight kind of traditional reviews and little features. But then, we were experimenting with using different forms of media. You couldn't have, there was no video online at that time. I mean, when the web first came out, I remember looking at the web for the first time and thinking like, oh, could we do video? And there was this technology called server push technology, which would like load literally one frame at a time. So it was very larval. But for me, it meant two things. It was like it was somewhere that I could write. I could write for the BBS, but then more importantly, I could write about this culture. And then, so the first real major magazine piece that I did was a feature story for Spin magazine back in 1996 about clans, teams of computer game players who played the game Quake. That was a very popular game at the time, and that was really for me the moment when I integrated both my interests in gaming and the internet, and then just writing for a magazine.
Yeah. So I'm 37. My, introduction to the internet was like AOL dial-up and, message, like the chat rooms and AOL Instant Messenger and stuff like that. But I knew that those boards existed, but I didn't know that there were like subscription publishing boards. So that's really interesting. And so you transitioned to becoming a magazine freelance journalist. And there's this stereotype today of the pre-2000 magazine journalist who wrote, a handful of articles for glossy magazines a year for $5 a word. They made this comfortable livings. And you can compare that to today, where there's this stereotype of the 24-year-old churning out 5 pieces a week for $200 each. How realistic is it, that stereotype of like the 90s magazine journalism? Like, was that really like the golden era of writing for magazines?
I never got $5 worth, but I was always hustling, it was hard work to get I was one of those people, I was in my 20s and I was just starting out. I was hustling to get the assignments, and it wasn't just that. For me, answering that question I'll give you, it's specifically the way to answer that for me is to talk about the internet and gaming and this culture and what the mainstream media thought about it, because I had to really fight to get a magazine like Spin, certainly Rolling Stone, to even devote any pages to this world, So I was in a different part. I wasn't this established writer who was, who had already had 100 articles. And so I remember, for example, with that article with Spin Magazine, I was trying to explain this concept to my editor that people can play computer games against each other over a computer. And that these people were making teams. And I was just getting crickets. I could not sell this story. There had been, I don't know that really, this is before Wired. Magazines just weren't covering this in a serious way. And finally I said, look, it's kind of like sports. It's kind of like sports. And I believe that the article was called The Dawn of Cyber Sports. So, I don't know. With the golden era, yes, the magazines were around there. Yes, they had a lot of pages and they had advertisers and all of that. But, personally for me, I just think back on that time as having to convince a lot of people about why they should pay attention to the internet and gaming.
I've had Clive Thompson on this podcast before, and he talked about how he eventually became like the quote unquote internet guy in the 90s, where like whenever a magazine writer or a magazine editor needed a story about the internet, he became that go-to guy. Was that kind of your experience too?
Yeah. I know Clive, and he and I both were doing similar things for different magazines. I was doing that at Spin. I became a columnist at Spin, and then I went over to Rolling Stone, and starting, I think in 1999, I did the first story on Napster. It wasn't a lot, and then Wired came around, and then Wired basically became obviously a magazine devoted to all of this stuff. But before Wired, there was a magazine called Mondo 2000, which was out of Berkeley, and it was devoted to cyber culture, and it was glossy and strange. And that's actually where I first got my start before Spin, was at Mondo 2000.
And then your big break was that you ended up publishing like a surprise best-selling book, right?
Well, the book, the first book was Masters of Doom, and that actually grew out of the coverage that I was doing on gaming at Spin and elsewhere. And it actually started with that article about the Quake clans. And for me, it was a similar motivation. I was just like, in that case, I was at a Barnes and Noble and just looking around and saying, why aren't there any books on gamers? Here's books on athletes and musicians and all of that. And so, one of the things that I really learned during those years was it took me a long time to realize how to pitch a story. It wasn't enough to say, I want to write a book about gamers. I had to understand, like, what's the story? Who are the characters? And I finally arrived at the co-creators of Doom and Quake. And, the way that I pitched that was that they were like the Lennon and McCartney of video games, which basically kind of sold that book. And then I spent a couple of years reporting that, moving down to Dallas, interviewing all of them and writing their story, which ended up being a very far-reaching story that's still rippling through the culture now. And there was so much innovation that came out of that period of time and out of those people. So that's what that book was about. It was kind of like the dawn of this new age of gaming.
And what kind of doors did the success of that book open for you?
It was definitely good because, there hadn't been a book about gamers like that. So, it was my first book, and it did get a lot of attention. It got a lot of reviews and all of that. And that was very cool. And I think from there, I just really sort of dug into that space in Rolling Stone, and went on to do all of those features, that were about, I was always kind of first at the door of these, like Mark Zuckerberg, in 2000 and whatever it was, 4 or 5, Facebook was just starting out. I mean, that was another good example. I think it's a really relevant thing to think about even today, which is that things change so quickly. And, you have to get the attention of editors. You have to get the attention of these publishers who aren't paying attention to what's happening. So how do you translate that to them? How do you get them interested? I had an interest in Facebook and what Mark Zuckerberg was doing in 2004 because that was my world, and I was reading about it in Harvard Crimson, and I thought there was a story, but it took a lot of convincing, of my editors to do it, despite the fact that I may have written this book, I still had to hustle, and then basically got them to give me the assignment to write this feature on Zuckerberg. But the funny thing is, and I actually recently just ran my original story on Substack because, when I was reporting that Zuckerberg feature, I got contacted by the Winklevoss twins, who no one knew about. I didn't really know about them. And I ended up writing the whole story of that battle over Facebook in 2005, but it wasn't relevant to Rolling Stone at the time, or really anyone, because Facebook was really not proving yet. And so this ended up being more of a profile of Mark, and all that part got cut out of the story.
Yeah, I mean, who cares if he stole an idea for
right? No one did
company.
No one did
because, it wasn't worth billions of dollars.
That's exactly right. And, we can come back to it. But I mean, that was one of the cool things about Substack and having a newsletter, which was that I could kind of revisit some of these pieces.
And we'll definitely get to that. And you also specialize in stories that tend to get optioned for film and television. Like, is that something you had and you started to develop in the back of your mind when you were pitching stories, or did you just kind of accidentally fall into that?
Yeah, not at all. I mean, not at all. Masters of Doom was the first thing that I had optioned. And no, I had no knowledge. I liked film and TV, but I knew nothing about any of that. And then what I found out, though, was that there was this long history of narrative nonfiction, behind movies like Saturday Night Fever. I mean, that started out as a New York Magazine story. I didn't know any of this. So, so starting with that first book got optioned, and then, some other things. I mean, there really wasn't actually much that I had in that game early on, but then it started to pick up. And I realized I would go out there to LA and have meetings. And I realized that, I kind of went to like an unofficial graduate school of working for these magazines and learning to write a certain way, which was cinematically. I mean, feature stories for Rolling Stone, feature stories for Wired. The conversations that I would have with my editors were very much about, who's the main character, right? What's the scene? What's the conflict? And so that was just how I wrote anyway. And what I didn't know is like, those are the stories that, there's people in Hollywood who are combing the pages of magazines looking for something to turn to movie or TV show. So it just lent itself to that kind of a treatment. And that's how that started. But for me, I mean, up until now, it's always story first, because there's nothing without the compelling story.
And the magazine industry kind of woke up to, all this IP that they were sitting on, and that there were more opportunities there. Mm-hmm. Condé Nast now has an entire division called Condé Nast Entertainment that isn't just about licensing stories. It's all about actually like acting as like a producer, working throughout the entire production life cycle of a movie. Mm-hmm. And for you, like, you saw that in your own writing, in the sense of like magazines started shifting how they bought up IP rights, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me
Yes,
about that.
absolutely. In fact, I believe that I was the first. One of my stories was the first one. I'm pretty sure it was the first one that Condé Nast Entertainment optioned. And I remember when that happened. It's a story called "The All American Bank Heist." I had written it for GQ magazine, and I remember when that happened. Prior to that moment, at least in my experience, I was able to I owned all my intellectual property, which is important to me both financially, but really kind of philosophically. I feel like as a writer, it's hard. It's hard to be a writer. And I think that as a writer of narrative nonfiction, it's not just what we write, but it's the stories that we choose to tell. And like those stories don't just exist. Like you have to go find them, right? And find the characters. And it's a whole experience of, seeking material, mining material, shaping material. So yeah, I feel like writers should own their intellectual property. And I never had to think about it because that's the deal that existed. When Condé Nast Entertainment came around, the industry was changing because advertising revenues were going down. The internet was starting to eat the publishing industry. So they basically had to figure out, well, how are they going to stay in business? What's their business model? And I absolutely don't blame them for that, or even now, but like, that's what they wanted to do. Then they said, we want to have the first look, the first rights. We want to take a piece of it. I was fortunate in that, because I was the first one there, I was able to carve out my rights and keep them and not have to continue to, feed the beast like that. So, but now, but then very recently, I would say in the last maybe 2 years or so, that business strategy has spread where almost every magazine now wants to keep either all or some of the intellectual property of the stories that they assign.
So what's the material difference? Like, let's say you sold
Mm-hmm.
a story in the year 2000
Mm-hmm.
and then it got optioned versus selling a story now
Mm-hmm.
at Wired and it gets optioned.
Mm-hmm.
What do you get out of it in the 2000 version versus this version?
Well, I mean, I don't want to get into like the particular numbers and all of that because it also varies so much depending on what it is. I mean, look, you could have, a guy like David Grand might write something for the New Yorker, and I mean, books can go for 7-figure bidding wars. I mean, I haven't had that happen to myself yet, but but the more basically up until that time, I was able to keep everything, and I should say I still made it a point to keep everything, but it could be half of the money, it could be all of the money, all of the derivatives, depending on what kind of a deal the writer made with that particular publication.
So we're sort of transitioning into your motivations for doing this experiment on Substack, and part of it has to do with the IP rights, and we'll talk about that. When did you first begin thinking about launching on Substack? Like the people, like the founders of Substack or someone associated with Substack approached you, right?
I had I'd been reading about Substack, and for a long time, I had been thinking about this idea of intellectual property, and but it was not just that. I don't want to make it sound like it was just that, because it really wasn't. It was also just about the freedom and flexibility to tell stories in ways that I wanted to tell them. In the publishing world, it's a long process. You get an idea, and then you have to pitch the idea. You have to write that up, you pitch it, then you wait, then you get the assignment, and then you do it. That takes time, and then you turn it in, and it can sit for weeks, months, over a year, depending on, current events, what else is in the magazine, other stories, advertising. And, the thing about me is that I've always had a lot of ideas for stories. That's never been a problem for me. The problem for me has been, how do I tell them and where? And and so that's been more of the challenge. So in recent years, with the magazine industry shrinking, and getting more, kind of less capable of handling all of this content, I wanted to go somewhere else. I was like, how can I tell these stories where I can, number one, sort of tell the stories I want to tell, and number two, maybe tell them in a different way. I'm like I said, I was experimenting with telling stories on the internet back in the early 90s. So that's just how I think. And I'm like, there's all kinds of, it doesn't just have to be print. I can incorporate different forms of media. So I was really looking for that. And then Substack came around, and I was following it. And, initially I didn't take a huge interest in it because of two reasons. One is I'm just not active on social media. It's just, I choose to write about the internet as opposed to write, for the internet. Mm-hmm. So, and that's just also a time management thing. So I wasn't really interested in that. And then also I felt like, my own cursory kind of look at the newsletter world, it seemed like a lot of different kinds of writers than me. They were writers like, Glenn Greenwald and Seth Abramson, and it seemed like, Matt Taibbi, like people who had strong opinions,
yeah,
and and
could churn out a ton of content.
And were really good at picking fights, and they were, it was just like a different kind of a writer, which is great, but that's just not me. Like, I'm a storyteller. I'm not out there doing all of that. So I didn't know if it would work for me. And also I can't just sit, in a room and then, wax on about, I could, but that's just not really what I like to do. I like to go out into the world and report. So, I wasn't sure if I would find a place there, but then I started, talking with some of the guys at Substack, and, they were familiar with, actually, Masters of Doom had been a book. A lot of software developers read that book, and so they were familiar with my writing. And, it seemed like this could be an opportunity where, and I was very clear. I just said, look, I don't have much of a social media following. I'm not really going to cultivate one. But I really am interested in telling stories. I also have a track record of stories that, do get into development. I had 2 movies come out this year based on my work, which was Zola.
What 2 movies?
So it was Zola. Zola was based on a story I wrote for Rolling Stone about a stripper in Detroit who went down to Florida and got mixed up with these sex traffickers. And that came out earlier this year. And then another one was Silk Road, which was also based on a Rolling Stone story. So, this is kind of who I am. And I didn't really see that manifested so much. I wasn't really reading a lot of long form narrative nonfiction that was created exclusively for Substack or anything like that. But they were game, and and so was I. And so I then and that was really my interest, and I thought I would do 2 things. Well, maybe 3 things. One was I thought that I could do a kind of a follow-up to this first book, Masters of Doom, because the lives of those characters have taken such amazing turns in the 20 years since I did that book, and in terms of this guy, John Carmack, going to Facebook, heading their virtual reality initiative, all the stuff now we know about Facebook and the metaverse. These guys were instrumental. So like there was a way to continue some of the conversation, not as a narrative like I did in my first book, but kind of more as a conversation with the readers in the sense of like, let's see where these people went. Let's look at how some of these ideas evolved. So that was one idea. And I called it Masters of Disruption, how the gamer generation built the future, and decided, okay, I'll serialize this exclusively in the newsletter. And so that was one idea. And then the other thing was to do original long form reported features in the newsletter, similar to the magazine work that I would do, but presented in a different way. You know, I called it like a post book or a post story, in the sense that it could be serialized stories that consist of multiple posts that could contain different kinds of media. I've done that so far with one story called Renaissance Texas about.
And we'll get into talking about that.
Okay.
So this is a somewhat new thing for Substack, is it's going after some book authors.
Right.
You know, Matt Taibbi was one of the people who originally serialized the book on Substack. Salman Rushdie has serializing some stuff apparently. You know, and then you got like a write up in the trades because of this. And then you got offered like a Substack Pro deal, like they offered you some kind of advance, right?
Yeah.
And as part of that advance, they allowed you to hire a freelance editor?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's basically, you know, for me, it's just like to be able to do the kinds of reporting that I want to do. It does take going places in it, right? So I have to fly somewhere. I have to stay somewhere, and then I have to report. But then I also have to have editors. I need a fact checker. You know, I should say you don't need that stuff. You know, there's nothing stopping anyone from writing anything on the internet, of course. But for me, it's like I wanted to do it the right way. I wanted it to be fact checked. I wanted it to be legally vetted and all of that. So in order to do that, that does require some support and some kind of a, infrastructure. And they provided that in a way that I could also work with editors I know. So, for example, you know, Masters of Disruption, I went and sought out my former editor, Wired Magazine, who I worked with forever, Chris Baker. And so Chris is editing that. I could also have a fact checker, and I worked with a designer to design the newsletter based on some ideas I had. So, that was crucial for me to be able to do this.
And they were pretty open-ended, like your contract is pretty open-ended. It's only like you have to publish like once a week or something like that? Or is it even that?
No, I mean, it's not, it's really more like, I think it's more like saying like they're willing to take a little bet on me, which probably is not as big of a bet as they would take on other people who've got millions of followers on Twitter. I mean, it was an opportunity it was basically an opportunity to have a go at seeing if this could work in a newsletter format.
And around what month did you launch the newsletter officially?
That's a good question because time flies, but it wasn't long ago. I think it was last month. It hasn't been long. I mean, it's been maybe 5-6 weeks, something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe I'm thinking of when I initially read the announcement was several months ago.
Okay.
And so let's talk about like what you're publishing on a weekly basis, because it seems like, I was looking today, you're doing a couple different things. Like you're serializing a book, but like you said, you're also serializing some like smaller stories, and then you're also resurrecting old articles that you published. So what are you publishing on like a weekly basis?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's fun for me about this is that it does remind me of the early 90s. It really, like, but it's for writers. That's the difference. All up until this point, these new technologies have really been leveraged by different kinds of content creators, for the most part. Game developers and, social media influencers and things like that. But with the newsletter, there's an opportunity to think about like how can I tell these stories, and it's like honestly for me it was overwhelming to think about, because there's zero rules. That makes it fun, but it makes it challenging, right? Because this is a newsletter it's being distributed to an email inbox. That's the way it goes, and Hamish at Substack has talked a lot about that, and why they like that. But as a writer, I'm thinking like, and this too, you do a newsletter, you're landing in someone's inbox. And I know that I'm pretty miserable when I check my email in the morning because I've just got a million things to deal with. And so I was really thinking about how do you do that? How do you not overwhelm somebody? How do you, what's the sweet spot? And especially if you're trying to tell a story, how can that work? So I have been experimenting with how to do that. And so what I've arrived at so far are these three kind of buckets. So as I was starting to say, one is Masters of Disruption. The difference between what I'm serializing and what I'm loosely calling a book, and perhaps what Salman Rushdie and these others are doing, is I think and Chuck Palahniuk is doing, I think they've written a text book, right, consisting of chapters, and they're parsing it over the internet. Whereas I haven't written a book that I'm just breaking up onto the internet. I'm kind of writing it in real time. I'm able to bend and kind of pivot based on current events and also the people I speak with. And I decided early on I would try to use different kinds of media, and that I would try to keep the posts really short. So the posts are just maybe 800 words for the most part. And I've decided and I've been doing that once a week, pretty much. I've been doing it every Tuesday, a new installment of that. And then the second part, and one of the things that I've been learning is this idea of consistent posting, like having certain days of the week. I think it works well for me, and ultimately may work well for a reader if they're aware that, like, oh, it's Tuesday, here's this Masters of Disruption post or what have you. So I've been doing that Tuesdays, and then Fridays I'll just do kind of something else, and that could either be the second bucket was doing these original, narrative features, serializing. I've done one so far, and I serialized it over 9 different posts. I have another one that I'm about to launch in the next week or so, which I'm going to try doing this one over less posts. It'll be maybe 3 or 4 that will come out, each week, maybe on a Friday.
And is that original piece, or is it?
Yes, it's an original. No, yeah. So I should be clear. There's the Masters of Disruption is this original book project. The feature stories are original exclusively for my newsletter. I did one called Renaissance Texas. I'm also doing interviews. I interviewed Jeff Tweedy of the band Wilco. So I'm doing online, newsletter feature only stories. And then I have a section called the Reporter's Notebook, which is kind of an opportunity for me to write about writing, talk about journalism, and reconsider, kind of curate my own archives and add value to them. So, for example, we were talking about Facebook. I wrote a 5,000 word profile of Zuckerberg in 2004 that it never was published in that form. And I think, I was thinking about it as a historical artifact. I wanted to get it out there because it was just really captured him at that time and the battle. So I'll put a story like that out, include a voice note where I'm talking for 2 minutes a little bit about how the story came together. So that's something I've arrived at as well, which is something that I really, I enjoy. So those are kind of the three buckets that I've been focusing on so far.
Yeah, so you're embedding little audio files at the top of the article, and they're only like 2 or 3 minutes long, and you're just talking a little bit about the story, right?
Yeah. It's just meant, I don't know. It's like as a writer, I've always, maybe I'm too empathetic to a reader because it's like, I have a short attention span when I something has to be presented to me in a certain way to keep my attention. So I kind of write like that. Like, I want to be entertaining. I want to keep people turning the pages, and when you're writing in a newsletter format, it's different, because of the reasons I said. You're competing with email, you're competing with everything. So I still don't know entirely what the answer is. I'll see if, the stats on a story that's serialized in 3 pieces maybe are better than one that's serialized over 9. I'm not sure. But again, like that's how I see this now. I don't see it so much actually as an experiment. It's kind of like, for me, I see this in the same context as everything else I've been writing about in the last 20 years, the internet. It's just the early days. I think that writers are going to have to figure out how to tell stories in this medium in this way, and also how to monetize them. And those are two areas that I'm really interested in, and I've been just trying to feel out with this.
And there's these questions about like, can long form reporting exist on Substack? Because can you produce like it at a high enough volume to where you can grow your audience? But it sounds like the serialization is your way of solving that. Like, you're not trying to write a 5,000 word feature every week.
No.
You're trying to write like maybe one 5,000 word feature a month, but then serializing it into like 5 parts.
Yeah, but I can't, even at I could never, even writing one 5,000 feature a month, I could never do that. I don't know that anyone can, because when you're reporting, it takes time. Typically to write a feature story, I'm spending, anywhere from 3 to 6 months, let's say, on average, for a long feature story. So that does take time to do. So, and some of these stories are ones that I had been working on for a while before I started Substack, and I was figuring I'd do something with them anyway. But I don't know. I don't know that every feature has to be 5,000 words, and and again, like the use of voice notes, podcasts. In fact, this week I'm going to be posting a podcast that's 40 minutes, and so. I think it's a time now where at least I'm trying to see what works, what works, what doesn't work, and go from there.
Well, what happens when you run out of that material you were working on in advance? Like, it seems like at some point it's going to be hard to maintain that publishing cadence.
I don't know, because I just have always written a lot. So maybe that'll be true, but I don't know. I've never experienced that. And I think I have enough that I'm always working on, and things that I can, revisit and reconsider, where I can find some flow, I can only do as much as I can do, but I think that, between everything I've written about and seen and all the people I've talked to over the last 25 years, that's a tremendous amount of content that I have. And it's just a matter of how I'm going to, utilize it.
So how are you growing your audience? Because like you admit that you don't have a huge following on Twitter. You don't have like a huge online presence. Obviously, with your track record, you could get access to people who have large followings. Like you have a profile, I think, of like Alexis Ohanian, who has probably like over 1 million Twitter followers. So if he shares that story, like you have access to these very powerful people. Is that your strategy?
It's funny you say that, because I just figured that out the other day. I wish I was more clever, because I wrote a post about Tom Hall, the game designer, and he shared it, and then I got all of his people coming in. I thought, oh, this is one way you could approach it, where you just write about people who have a lot of followers. But the problem is that I don't know how to think that way. Like, I have to start with the story. And if somebody who has a lot of followers is a germane part of the story, then that's a nice benefit. But, it's always the story first. Alexis Ohanian, he was a guy who grew up on Doom and Quake. He's a guy who's very much thinking about NFTs and the metaverse and gaming. He's someone I've wanted to talk with. So that made sense. But, this is the thing. For 30 years, I've been doing this. I've been a writer for 30 years, and any success that I've had with books, with adaptations, with articles, always started the exact same way, which is I found a story that I loved so much that I couldn't wait to tell other people about it. And, I don't know. It's like, I'm not going to break that. That's my approach. And it's like, I don't know that it'll work in this format. But I think that, that's the identity that I've built. And that's basically the way that I think about it is it's kind of writing on faith a little bit that, okay, I'll just continue to find stories that people will want to read. So for example, I hope, and they may not, some of them they may not want to read, but there's a story that I'm going to be publishing, later this month that is, I write a lot of crime stories, kind of offbeat heist stories. And this is one that's very much like that. It's just like a good yarn, that hopefully is entertaining. And there's zero famous people in it, and there's zero anyone with any followers in it. So, but hopefully the story itself will be compelling enough that people will want to read it.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're not doing anything strategic to build your audience. You're kind of taking the "if we build it, they will come" strategy, which you don't know yet is if it's going to pay off.
I mean, I am being strategic in the sense that I'm like, this book that I'm serializing is something that's targeted for my core readers. I mean, it is very thoughtful in that sense that like, that's for the core readers. Hopefully they'll come. The feature stories are ones that's like my bread and butter. I can maintain the intellectual property. These are, I could write the kind of stories that I've learned people do like to read. And then, and the third one, the Reporter's Notebook, I've also done teaching. I've taught at NYU and at Princeton. I have people who are interested in writing. So it's just sort of building on what I've already established. So if there's a strategy, I mean, there is a strategy, and the strategy is really just kind of focusing on what has gotten me to where I am now and how can I build on it, as opposed to just contriving something completely different.
It seems like all your content is free so far. Like, are you actually charging money to subscribers?
So basically, yes, there is a subscription. But right now, I mean, this is still early for me, and I just want to put everything out there for free and just, build an audience and go from there. My purpose with this, it's interesting what you said about like, build it and they will come. I guess that is partly true. I think that, is it possible to write long form stories on the internet and tell these stories in a way that will just attract an audience? Obviously I have to get the word out. And I do that as best I can. But I think for a writer like me and perhaps others, and there are a lot of them out there. I mean, that's the thing is like, there are a lot of people who they're known as writers, but they rely on the magazines to get the word out when they have a new story. So, I think this is partly what I'm playing around with, but I'm taking the long view and really trying to build something that'll be sustainable, but also, it's not like I'm just chasing that subscription dollar every day and trying to churn out content and losing sight of why I'm a writer in the first place.
Yeah, and I'm sure it sounds like probably the Substack Pro Advance helps with this because like you're making money on this even if you're not really too focused on subscriptions as of yet.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's about building something long and lasting and sustainable. And as a guy who writes long form journalism, I'm not just going to go out of the gate and and then lock it. I'm gonna, and this is very much in keeping just with what I've experienced over the internet. This is not, this really comes directly from my experience working in and around the internet for over 25 years. At SonicNet, we did have people would pay for some of the content, but a lot of it was free, in those early video games like Doom. They gave it away. They gave away Doom. They gave it away as shareware. And the idea was if you played a certain number of levels, you would get hooked and then you would pay for the rest. So, the Grateful Dead, the model of letting people come and tape their concerts. It was completely heretical at the time. They ended up being one of the top grossing bands ever. So for me, it's not about becoming the top grossing writer ever, but it is about just building and engaging an audience. And, and so the approach I'm taking is similar, which is give it away, be free, build a community, and then, kind of monetize it from there down the line.
Yeah, I actually have a newsletter coming out hopefully later today where I kind of ask the question, like, do subscribers even care if your content is paywalled? And I'm writing about some of these newsletter writers who are seeing success with just keeping 100% of their content completely free and then just kind of doing it as like a patronage model, and why that works for individual creators while it doesn't work for, like, publishers like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. And it seems like subscribers, they view creators in a different way than they view those media corporations.
I don't know, maybe I'm idealistic, but it's the music that I like too. I still listen to like indie rock bands. The artists who I like, the writers who I've read, have always been about the story, the music, what they're creating, put it out there, give it away, keep it cheap, and build an audience. And that's what I've done in my, offline career. And it's gotten me to this point. And so I'm really bringing that same philosophy to the newsletter.
Have you experienced over the past month or two anything you didn't expect while running this experiment?
Yeah. And I would say, the thing is experiment. It's like, I just want to, it's not, to me, it's really not an experiment. It's more of just, of a nascent exploration of something. It's just different because experiment to me, it implies something that doesn't last. And I think this is more of just trying to harness this like new power. But anyway, but as far as like the surprises, I think that, one thing I did do is like early on, I shut off the community features on my newsletter entirely, which may make no sense. Because I know the idea is that you keep them on, you cultivate them, you let that build. But I decided early on not to do that because I felt like if I'm not going to engage in that and maintain it and participate, then there's no point in doing it. Like, I just felt like, again, it's just coming back to this idea of like what's organic to me and the way that I've been. So what was surprising was, I guess, realizing that I can do that and that that's possible, that I could kind of continue to write, just focus on writing the stories and putting them out there. And that's the kind of engagement that I have. So, it was nice to realize that I can do this. Maybe that's going to inhibit some growth that I would have otherwise. But, I had to bend this to kind of just fit the person who I am and the kind of writer that I am. And yeah, I think that, as far as other surprises along the way, I've been surprised, I would say, that more artists and writers have not come to this medium yet. Like Jeff Tweedy is one who has, Patti Smith has, in terms of musicians writing here. I've been a little surprised, I guess, that there hasn't been more adoption in that area, and and more of the kind of long form writing. So, but I think that's maybe just to come.
Yeah. Obviously, if you're super famous, you could probably make this model work. I think a lot of people who have a okay following and track record, like they're when they do this, they're finding out it's a bigger grind than they.
But it is. You're right about that. But this is what I'm saying. You're right, and I got caught up in that grind a little bit And I start thinking, though, but this doesn't feel right. And I think that that's the problem. This is the problem, I think, right now, which is that a lot of people, I mean, listen, everybody has to do what they have to do. But I think that I know this. I know this because I had to do it as a writer for magazines. I had to figure out how to make it, and the way that I made it was to be very specific about what are the stories that I'm going to tell? Because I could have chosen earlier on, nobody wanted to write about the internet. Nobody wanted to cover the internet. I was getting turned down left and right. But, I stuck with it. So I'm coming to this newsletter with a very informed perspective on how a writer can build a career. And I think that what I'm seeing somewhat is that there's a lot of chasing of the subscriptions early on, and that people get caught up in a grind that perhaps loses sight of really why they're doing it in the first place. And that it's not just about, to me, yes, building subscriptions is a part of it, but I think that when you're a writer, you're not just going for that. You're building yourself as a brand. You're not going to just write for one medium. You might write books, you might write for television, you might write for film. So I think that if you're just chasing the subscriptions, you may be selling yourself short, because if you're a little bit more holistic about it and are thinking about, what are the stories that I have to share, that will build your brand. That will build a career where all of the parts will be kind of working together, if that makes sense. So that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah. And, a lot of people are selling things like consulting, the newsletter advertising market is really kind of heating up quickly. So I think like the next iteration, like the first iteration was subscriptions. Mm-hmm. The next iteration that you're seeing emerging is more kind of diversified businesses coming down the pike. Do you have any plans to package any of this stuff, especially like this book you're publishing, into any kind of like print book at any point, even if it's like a collector's edition or anything like that?
Maybe, but I don't have a plan for that. And that's also specific because I wanted to write something that's for this medium, like specifically for the medium. Maybe there's something that grows out of it, that could certainly happen. But that's not the idea. The idea is just like finding a place where I can tell the stories that I want to tell in the way I want to tell them. I wrote the Renaissance Texas. That's a story I've been carrying around in my head for 17 years, actually. I've literally thought about writing that for 17 years. And it was great to have an opportunity just to do it, and also to do it in the way that I wanted to. And I think that, Zola, who I wrote about and for Rolling Stone, she was really she was the first person who broke, I would say the first breakout writer of Twitter, because she told a story. She told a story of 140 tweets about her experience, and people read it. And she wasn't seeking anything other than telling her story. People read it around the world. She went viral, and then it became a movie. I don't think that we haven't seen that yet in Substack. We haven't seen. We've seen the opinion writers, but we haven't seen a kind of a story rise out of this newsletter world, capture an imagination, and then maybe manifest in TV, film, some other way. So, but that will come. And that's what my interest is, so I have a lot of these long form stories, that are that I'm going to be writing and putting out there that are, with that kind of an intent, using Substack to put a story out there into the internet consciousness and see what happens.
Is it your hope that this is so successful that you don't have to go back to traditional publishing?
No, because I don't. The thing is, I'm like the worst person to ask these questions to, in a way, because it's like I'm agnostic. Fundamentally, I'm agnostic. It's just like it's the story first, and whether I write it for Rolling Stone or in my newsletter or, on the back of a cereal box. It's really about wanting to tell a story and getting it out there so people can read it. And right now in a newsletter, I can write a 5,000 word story about a murder at a Renaissance fair, or I could write a story about, a heist of a high school cafeteria, which is this next one that I'm doing, without having to, without having to wait. So that's my approach. It's a very different approach. It may work in some places and it may not work in some places. But at the very least, I hope that, and I enjoy having this kind of conversation because, I believe in the future of journalism, but I also believe that people have got to take risks. So I think that's a better way of thinking about it than experimentation, actually. It's risk. Like, I think that long form writers are going to have to come and take more risks with the kinds of stories they're telling, and see and do it in this format and see what happens there.
Yeah, I mean, I also think you're at a stage in your career that, like, a younger person, like, you have some flexibility that you could have the fallback of the glossy magazine or the book deal, and so, like, you can experiment. I kind of think of you as being in kind of like, the Malcolm Gladwell stage of your career, in the sense of, like, Gladwell, he had the prestige job at the New Yorker, he had the book deals, and now, I don't know if you're following what he's doing now, but he's basically just doing whatever the fuck he wants. He's running Pushkin Industries. He's creating these long, meandering podcast series where he reimagines the plot of The Little Mermaid, the Disney movie, like all this kind of stuff. He's producing his own audiobooks and stuff like that. I don't know. It just seems like, that like you're at a nice place where you could kind of experiment a little and play jazz
to a certain degree. But at the same time, though, I think that, like, I think if a story is good enough, it doesn't matter what kind of track record you have. That's just the difference of, like, because I've seen it. Zola, just coming back to Zola, she had zero. She was as much of a nobody as anybody was before they're known, and she broke, and she told a story that captured the attention of the world. So I don't agree that I think that anybody can, like, come to this medium and find an audience and get all the subscribers they want if they focus on the right stories to tell. And maybe that's a bit of a contrarian point of view. But I do believe that that's true. And I think that we'll see examples of this as this goes, as it matures.
Okay, David. Well, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
On Twitter, just David Kushner, and then my Substack, davidkushner.substack.com.
Okay, well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast, so if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.